We're going to start out, as I introduce our guest speaker today, we're going to start out with a poll like we do every week. So you're going to receive a poll. This is our first question of the hour, and it's how much of your daily behaviors are impacted by your company's strategy. Okay, so we have the poll. You should have it out there right now. Please answer the questions. It's either none, some, or a lot. How much of your daily behaviors are impacted by your company's strategy? I'll give you guys a few minutes to answer that question while I introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker for today is actually a good friend of mine, Edward Blackman, and Edward is the founder and managing partner of Kelda Consulting. His experience includes 20 plus years of working to transform businesses, resulting in tremendous improvements to safety, quality, cost, delivery, and morale. Edward has a master's degree in behavioral science, and along with undergraduate degrees in psychology and mathematics. He is a certified Six Sigma Black Belt. He is certified in labor standards, a lean Toyota production system instructor and coach, a kata coach, a certified scrum master, and an agile coach. And I will say, I've worked with Edward personally in a few different areas, and he has been an amazing coach to me as well. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say today about behavioral science and how it applies to business. All right, so let's end the poll. I'm going to shoot the results over to you, Edward, and to everyone else so they can see.
Wow.
All right, so with that, let me turn it over, Edward.
Thank you, Patrick.
Absolutely.
So the results that we see here is 2% none, 51% some, and 47% a lot. And so I guess the question becomes, what does perfect look like? What does ideal state look like? What do you think, Patrick?
What does ideal look like? I would say that our daily behavior should be impacted by our company strategy a lot. I mean, I would say that it definitely has to be impacted by company strategy. We need to have a direction and know exactly how those daily behaviors are going to not only affect what we're doing day by day, but how it's going to impact us long term and really affect that company strategy.
Very well said. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree. If your strategy is not impacting the daily behaviors of your team, then what is it doing? And if there's a gap there, that gap is what we would call a problem from a continuous improvement perspective. So we have quite the mix of an audience today between behaviorists and CI practitioners and some leaders and executives as well. So I'm going to avoid getting too technical in either field and try to stay a little bit high level. But aligning on what is perfection for your company is really value added. Whether or not you reach it or not is a whole nother matter, but it is a good direction setting approach to ask, what does better look like? What does perfect look like? And we'll get into that a bit more in the presentation as well. So I do have a slide deck, so I'm going to switch over and start sharing my screen. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then you just let me know, I know we have a second poll question too around company strategy. Just let me know when you want me to shoot that out to everybody.
Okay, sounds good.
Go ahead and share your screen. Welcome everyone.
You get to see, I have way too
many. All right, there we go.
Open. Wow.
And it's coming up. There it is.
Wonderful. So the high-level overview for today's behavioral science applied to business. Actually done a couple of these presentations recently, and one of the things I'd like to do differently today is instead stay at the high level, talk about a specific example of applying behavioral science to a continuous improvement approach and see the impact of that. The background and overview, here's actually my brochure. Patrick already covered some of that. The topic for today, and then the specific example that we'll get into is strategy, and we'll get into what's called the perfect day workshop and mountain mapping.
Yeah, I'm excited about that.
Good, good. It's for the CI folks on the line, it's a version of Hoshinkanri, if you're familiar with the concept.
Yes.
So example concepts from behavioral science. Honestly, we could do webinars in every single one of these things, but I throw out a few topics so it could pique people's interest, and then later on they could Google search it or give us more information about what they would like a deeper dive on. Behavioral pinpointing, one of the first steps with behavioral science is what is behavior? and we like to talk about behavior is something that's observable. So if I put a video camera on you, what's recorded is the actual behavior. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about inner thoughts or cognition, things like that. We're talking about more what's external, what's observable.
Sure.
Caveat with that, I'll say, is vocal behavior is also considered a type of behavior. So there's a field within behavioral science called verbal behavior, and there's a lot of books on that one. So, but speaking, talking is a type of behavior that's observable. Second piece, response effort analysis. This is where we get into what's called contingencies of behavior. So we start to talk about whether or not the consequence of a behavior is enough to drive it, the effort, if you will, involved. Is it worth the outcome that I get? Feedback systems. There's a lot of work done by behavioral scientists around feedback systems. And in fact, for some consulting companies, that's most of what they do, is design better feedback systems. And feedback is greatly important. One of the struggles companies have is they don't necessarily have good feedback systems, or what they have might be actually punitive in nature. So feedback can be positive, negative, neutral. It doesn't have to just be punishing. And so we don't want to associate feedback with just punishment contingencies, they're called.
That's such an important topic too, Edward, because a lot of times as leaders, or even when I'm out working with different management and I watch them, that it does seem like feedback is always negative, or the majority of the time it's negative, and it's almost like we have to be very intentional about switching that up and going out and being very active around positive feedback, and because the impact of the positive feedback is probably even way higher as far as the impact on those people than what the negative is.
Absolutely. To boil it down a little bit, if every time I interact with my leader and that leader only gives me negative feedback, then I'm going to associate that leader with negative feelings.
Right.
And that's not a good thing. We need to actually identify, see, and reinforce or reward positive behaviors as well. And it's really important. There's actual ratios out there that talk about it. There's a thing called a sandwiching technique. There's a lot of approaches to doing it. I'll just say that from kind of a smart aleck perspective, positive feedback should be more than 0. So if it's not happening at all, then let's try to increase it. And it's also a great way to grow coaches, to see who is exhibiting the right behaviors, rewarding that, and then grow them into potential coaches for others.
Sure. And for those of you that understand leader standard work too, me personally, I would dedicate time. I mean, you're always looking for opportunities to give feedback, right? But I would dedicate time to be very intentional, especially if it's not something that you are normally doing, right? If you have to remind yourself, put it on your leader standard work and make sure that you're getting out there and giving positive feedback to your team members, right?
Absolutely. Very good point. D, I like to throw D in because there's a thing called pre-match principle, or pre-matching and matching law. This is where we start to get into a bit of the math associated with behavioral science. Picnic analysis, I got some feedback from folks that they would actually like a webinar just on this one. And this is a specific tool that gets into if a consequence of behavior is positive, immediate, and certain, or negative, immediate, and certain, a way to see that it's more likely to influence behavior than something that's delayed or uncertain. Yeah, it's actually a fascinating one. We'll probably do something on that later.
We should talk about that. Maybe we'll throw something out there in the next couple months around that topic.
That would be cool. I'd love to grow more behavioral scientists.
Very nice.
Performance management. So unfortunately, performance management does tend to have a negative connotation in a lot of companies.
Sure.
It tends to be associated with punishment and things like that. Honestly, my view on performance management is if it's done really well, it can really grow a company. And your performance management approach should be aligned with your company's strategy. And that's where we need to look at certain projects and objectives to make sure that we're not designing in what's called perverse incentives. So when we try to design reward systems for certain behaviors, sometimes we actually accidentally create perverse systems that create the opposite behavior. And it's really unfortunate when that happens. I've had quite a few experiences like that, where projects will continue because of the objectives set in the beginning of the year, and yet the environment changed. It's dynamic. And
Right.
so people continue with the project because it's tied to their bonus, instead of having some type of PDCA or feedback cycle that allows you to adjust those objectives.
Yes. I love that you're throwing that out there, because that is probably one of the number one things that I hear when we talk about performance management is, what happens when something changes? Do we just keep pushing forward even though this objective doesn't matter anymore? It was put in my objectives 3 months ago. Do we continue even though, COVID hits, right?
Exactly.
We have to know that things are going to happen, and we have to be able to adjust and be flexible with our team in order to have a good performance management system in place. So I appreciate the fact that you brought that up.
Yeah, very good points, Patrick. It's very salient with what we have going on right now.
Right.
And whatever our system is for setting up annual objectives, and whether or not we should have annual objectives at all is a whole nother conversation, but we should design any objective setting system to be adjustable.
Right.
We are in a dynamic environment, not a static environment. So when new things come up, we shouldn't punish people for trying to adjust their behaviors.
Right. Tyler has a quick question around this one before we move on, Edward. He wanted to know, are the goals that we're talking about, are these related to business success or competencies for the employees?
Yes. So it's related to all of those. So the individual competencies or skills of an individual should be aligned with the overall objectives. So to take a step back, if we want to increase our quality for the year, and we have certain projects associated with improving our quality, then we need to ask, well, do people have the competencies or skills to accomplish those projects? And so there's a chain that happens there. That chain is something that we call a system. And so is the system aligned and set up for success?
Perfect.
Behavioral engineering model. So this is something I love. There's a great book by Gilbert written in 1978 that goes over something called the behavioral engineering model, or sometimes called matrix, but it looks at the environment around an individual, and it looks at 6 different categories to see whether or not the individual is set up for success. If we're getting behavior other than what we want, if we're getting outcomes other than we want, the metrics are still not aligned, we have KPI gaps, key performance indicator gaps, don't blame the individual. If you feel the need to blame anything, blame the system or the environment around the individual.
That's right.
First, look and see whether or not the individual is set up for success. And the behavioral engineering model is really good as a diagnostic tool to see whether or not the individual is set up for success. Ask that first. And if everything is lined up, and I would say 90% of the time in my experience, or majority of the time, people are not set up for success. If after that you still feel the need to blame the individual, maybe we can go there. I just want to say that most people do not go to work to do a bad job.
That's
They
right.
go there to be successful. They take pride in their work. So blaming the individual is really a deleterious path. You don't want to go down there. First, see if they're set up for success. That's
right. And there's so many ways that you can do that too. And it just made me think about the red bead experiment, which is a great, if those of you that are on the webinar with us right now, if you're not familiar with the red bead experiment, you can go out on YouTube and you can search it and just watch a video on the red bead experiment. But it's just a great way to understand how the system can really create some problems for your employees. And just to what you're talking about, Edward, people come to work and they want to do a good job, and we have to be cognizant of that and know that it's the system that we need to focus on, not the people.
Yes, absolutely.
We did have a question that popped in. How does objectives and performance reviews, MBO, which Dr. Deming considered a deadly disease, align with strategy and development, or does it not? And then do you believe that that performance reviews can be done correctly without pitting employee against employee?
Yes. Dr. Edward Deming is the gentleman that we're talking about. Brilliant individual. Had a lot to do in North America with the quality movement, a lot to do in Asia with the quality movement, in Japan. But he is also the one that you want to Google along with the red beta experiment. He was famous for that. But management by objectives, MBO, was considered a really bad thing for him. I'm going to say 100% of the companies that I've worked with have some type of objectives that they set on an annual basis. It's extremely rare to find a company that doesn't. So if you're in an organization that does management by objectives or has some type of objective setting approach on an annual basis, how do you be successful in that environment, right? If you're an executive or CEO or CXO of some type, maybe you have influence on that approach of objective setting. But I'm going to say, go out on a leap and say a majority of the people on this call and that'll listen to this webinar probably aren't at the C-suite level. Mm-hmm. So how do you properly work within that? Right. You do some of the things that Patrick and I are talking about. You try to influence whether or not that system is adaptable. Right? Is it set for the entire year and, blinders on, no matter what, we're going to finish this project? Okay, that's a bad approach, and so you walk people through that. You give them some hands-on exercises like the red bead experiment, which is excellent hands-on experience to learn about that. You give examples from other companies that have been more successful. Right? So one of the basics in behavioral science is we don't want to institute a new behavior that only stays in place by the audit police. If we want a new behavior to stick, we want the new behavior to be easier and more successful than the old behavior. Right? And so the classic example is typewriters. Patrick, do I have to force you to stop using your typewriter and move over to your laptop? No, right? Your laptop is actually easier to use from a behavioral perspective. You receive more rewards, you have faster feedback, you're able to edit and change things faster than you were the old typewriter. So your new behaviors are easier than the old ones. So there's a lot around that one. I'm hoping that's answering the questions a little bit.
Yeah, I think so.
I will fully acknowledge there's a lot of passion around MBOs.
Right, I understand that too. we could probably do a whole webinar on MBOs alone, so maybe that's something we'll think about for the future.
Yeah, good point.
Okay.
And so the last one I want to bring up is a perfect day exercise and creating a mountain map. And so that's the one we're going to take a deeper dive into today. So this might be a good time to ask the second poll question.
Absolutely. So I'm going to launch a second poll to everybody. And for those of you that have joined us after we started, we do have a chat box open up. Please use the chat box with any questions or comments or support information that you want to really engage with us. Use the chat box. Make sure you choose all panelists and all attendees so that everyone on the call can see what your question is, and we'll do our best to answer those. The poll is now in progress. It's how often do you look at your company strategy? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or annually? How often are you actually taking a look at your company strategy? So the answers are coming in. We'll give you guys a few minutes to answer that poll, and then we'll end the poll. So looks like we have quite a range here of answers, Edward. Just another minute or two, and I'm going to end the polling. How often do you look at your company strategy? All right, I'm going to end the polling with that and share the results. There you go.
Yeah, that's about what we would expect. Actually, probably a little bit better than we
I would say so too.
Yeah. So we have some good behaviors. The extreme non-example, some behavioral science, we talk about examples and non-examples. Examples are what you want, non-examples are what you don't want. And so the extreme non-example for company strategy is, it's set once a year or once every few years, depending on what you talk about for mission, vision, and strategy. But the extreme non-example is setting it once a year and then putting it on the shelf, letting it collect dust, and never referring to it.
Right.
The opposite approach of that is whenever I'm facing a decision and I need to do A or B, well, which one lines up with our strategy? Let's look at our strategy, have it evergreen, ever present, and say, oh, this decision B lines up better with our strategy. Let's do that instead. And so if your strategy isn't a guide for your decision making, then there's an opportunity, there's a gap there. Okay, so terminology. We in behavioral science and we in continuous improvement tend to get a bit pedantic about terminology. There's lexicons in both fields. I want to say I'm not looking to get into any type of deep religious debate about terminology. I would say most of us were trained by different mentors in a variety of contexts by different companies, and so we all have different versions and different exposures to continuous improvement, to lean, to behavioral science, things like that. So I would ask for a bit of leeway when we're using some of these terms. They might not be exactly how you were trained on them, but give them a try, see if they're successful, stay true to the experimental mindset, PDCA mindset, and give them a try and see if they help. If they don't, adjust.
Yeah, I appreciate you throwing that out there, Edward, because we do have individuals from all over the globe, different industries, healthcare, manufacturing. So, there are going to be different terminologies, and so I appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Perfect Day is a workshop. I learned this this approach from Herman Miller primarily. They were taught by Toyota, Mr. Oba. But they came into a healthcare client, company I was working for, and asked us a really basic question in our clinics. What is a perfect day for your customers, in this case, patients, and what is a perfect day for your staff, including physicians, clinicians, administrative staff, all them? And they went up to a whiteboard and listed out their responses. Perfect day for the patient, perfect day for staff, employees. And it was fascinating because then they got into, well, perfect day for a patient is, honestly, I have to fill out zero paperwork. I get to go directly to the exam room, right? There's no waiting, things like that. Mm-hmm. Perfect day for a physician is her patient is in the room and ready when she enters the room, things like that. And so they listed out all these attributes of the perfect day for a patient, for staff. And then they said, okay, let's add numbers to this. And so 0% waiting, 100% on time, right? That's what we call a delivery metric, right? Zero paperwork, right? Well, paperwork might be necessary, but no patient ever goes to a clinic or to a hospital to have a perfect form filling out experience. No, that's silly. They go there to get healthy. It's an unfortunate necessity in many cases to fill out forms. So if that's not why they're there, if that's not a perfect day for them, how do we minimize the stuff that doesn't add value to the customer, right? And maximize the stuff that does.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. And I know you're going to show us some examples here. You mentioned, the 100% this or perfect that. And sometimes people get a little hung up on that, the idea of, well, we're never going to arrive at 100% value add. We're never going to arrive at zero defects. We're never going to arrive at one piece flow. We're never going to have the perfect experience. So why do we even throw it out there? But I think I know exactly how you would answer that question, which would be the same as me, and the fact that it doesn't matter if it's possible or not. It gives us direction. And it keeps us in line. And when things happen that pull us off the trail, that perfect goal is what keeps us aligned and puts us back on track, right?
Absolutely, you nailed it, Patrick. You nailed it. It's so to people often when they first get exposed to this approach, they'll quote Voltaire: "Perfect is the enemy of better." Yeah, sure. Perfect is the enemy of better if it prevents action. Yeah, if you're not iterating or moving towards it, if you're just standing still and debating what is perfect, I'm with you on that one. Right. But to your point, perfect sets a direction. Yeah. And I'll say it this way. The analogy is, let's say I want to travel with my family, and this bad time of year for travel, I get that. But let's say we want to travel. Well, we pick a destination, and our destination is either Florida or California. Well, then we decide how we're going to get there. It's a what versus how conversation. But once we agree that, no, we want to go to Florida, that's where the relatives are, good time of year, yada, yada. Disney at one time was open, unfortunately not now, but you agree on the direction, you agree on what is perfect, and then you start iterating, working towards that, coming up with your KPIs, your objectives, and things like that, and you pick your path, your journey towards that direction.
That's right.
So once you have alignment on what is perfect, and that is a big what if, then going in that direction is so much easier. Right? So some of the terminology that we'll use, current state is where you are today. Ideal state is what we would call perfection. It's called something slightly different in kata and continuous improvement, and behavioral science even has a different version of that for our lexicon. But we'll talk about current state, ideal state, and then future states iterating towards ideal state.
Perfect.
Some pic collages of places where this has been done it all over the globe, actually. Here's the visual that's associated with it. Here's a basic one around visual management systems. So starting down at the lower left-hand corner is your current state, right? And one of the first questions that we ask with visual management systems, in this case, we'll talk about Kanbans in an administrative setting, not Kanbans on a manufacturing floor. They are applied differently in those settings.
Yes.
Can we see the flow of work, right? Next question is, can we see the unit of work moving through that flow? Then can we see people huddling around that work? And then we keep talking up until we get to the upper right-hand side, which is where we start talking about perfection. So perfection in a visual management system setting for administrative areas is all the vice presidents or all of your executives have aligned visual management systems that work together, right? So it's a bit of the symbolism associated with climbing the mountain to get towards perfection. Mm-hmm. A little less abstract. After we talk about the steps, I'll leave this up here for a minute. These are basically the steps that you go through in a workshop to get people aligned around this perfect day and creating this visual that they will use later on in life. But I like to use very basic 6-box value stream maps.
Yeah, very nice. That makes it very simple to be able to understand the steps that it takes to get there. And I know you're going to walk us through that. But I also want to point out how powerful it is to get your thinking out of your head and make it visual. You hit on that very briefly, but we have to make things visual in order to bridge the gaps for language and cultural differences. And I mean, if I can visually see something, and it makes it a lot easier for me to understand if I can visually see it, the other person who maybe speaks a different language or understands things differently or has a different cultural background is going to see it the same way versus us talking and keeping it in my head. It's very much more difficult for them to understand exactly what's happening. So the power in making it visual is such an important concept.
Absolutely. Hey, Patrick, are you familiar with the tool versus behavior debate?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that pops up a lot is CI people like to talk about, well, let's not do a tool-based approach. Let's do a behavior-based approach. From my perspective, it's not a either or. It's a false dichotomy. Part of setting up people for success is making sure that they have the tools that they need in order to be successful. One of those tools might be a visual to help them. And to your point, it helps get the thinking out of our heads and make it observable for a bunch of people. Plus, I love the approach because it gets the debate away from, hey, Patrick and I aren't aligned. No. Let's put our thinking on the visual and let's attack the visual, not attack each other. And when you have the visual, you're able to actually align and collaborate on the debate on the visual instead of each other.
Powerful. That's a powerful way to explain it. Like it.
So here's an example template. There's different software you can use for this, Sheets, Excel, Google Slides, or PowerPoint. There's a lot of things. Whiteboard is another thing that you can use within Zoom.
Yeah.
If you have that functionality. But if you, can you see my cursor right now, Patrick?
Yes.
Okay. So again, you start down at current state where you're at today, and you travel up the mountain to ideal state. You take a journey up the mountain. It's discontinuous because, to the point we made earlier, you might not reach ideal state. You might not reach perfection.
Sure.
So you talk about current state where you're at today, ideal state, and then you start talking about future state 1, future state 2, 3, 4, and so on. So iterating towards ideal state. Then you talk about the objectives that get you to future state 1, the objectives that will get you to future state 2, and so on. And to give a concrete example, here's one that's actually filled out. So here's an Agile journey map. This is the Agile journey that one org was taking their version of Agile. If you're not familiar with Agile, and again, don't beat me up on terminology, one view of Agile is it is continuous improvement applied to IT. There's a lot more to it, but just the short and sweet of it.
Sure.
So here you can see they're going up the mountain, trying to reach ideal states. They have annual goals they're trying to meet, quarterly ones, end of year 2018. Here are the items that they're going to reach for future state 8 with automated deployment of code into production, things like that. So you can see this is the visual that the team used to align on here's what we want to accomplish, here's how we want to accomplish it, and we're going to talk about whether or not we're getting there, the reflection cycle that we like to use. So here's another example. So here's where we start getting a little bit more concrete into the KPIs. In CI, we like to talk about the 5 standard KPIs of safety, quality, delivery, which is speed, cost, and people/morale. So here, we're journeying up the mountain, discontinuous, up to ideal state. This is a blank template where we're able to see, okay, where are we at current state? If we're in an administrative setting, let's say we're in finance, or let's say we're in HR. How do we define safety in HR? All right, is it physical harm, mental harm, things like that? And if it is, how would we associate a score with that? Right? And often when I do these workshops, the response is, we don't know. You know, we've never defined safety in that way before, right? And that comes up for a lot of these KPI categories. So the behaviors associated with having that debate, right? A team of people, a team of leaders, frontline staff, having that debate and trying to define, here are our top 5 most important KPIs. Well, let's figure this out together. They go through what's called a data journey. So often they'll say, we don't know, then we'll just say, speculate. I think I'm 80% safe. I think we're 20% safe. Okay, well, debate. Why do you have such polar opposite opinions of how safe you are? And then through that debate, through that exchange of behaviors where they're learning from each other, their different perspectives, they align. Oh, you know what, we're probably somewhere in the middle based on what you just said. I see your point of view. So they speculate on their current level of safety, their percentage. Then they manually obtain data to support their speculations. And then the stuff that's actually value added, the useful stuff from their manual collection, they'll automate. And then they'll eventually have some type of automated system to help them with their current state of their safety KPIs.
Edward, I think you're going to get to this in a minute, but there was a question that came into the chat box around how do you set the target? What is your feeling on stretch targets?
Oh, great questions. So I would strongly advise against setting a future state target before you know your current state. It just doesn't make sense. So if you know you're at 50% right now, and let's say that most of the time, what's over here in ideal states is consistent. So 100% safe is normally ideal states, 0% crashes or 0% defects for quality, and so on. 100% on time. These tend to be consistent for ideal state. So if we're at 50% now, ideal state is 100%. Well, that's a 50% gap. Never jump to, oh, we want to get to ideal state within one iteration. It's too much of a stretch.
Right.
if we have a poor understanding of our current state baseline, which I would say is we don't understand why we're at 50% very well. We still have to investigate and diagnose that better. Then a basic rule of thumb is double the good or half the bad. So double the good in this scenario is we're at 50%, we want to get to 100% eventually. So we'll double it and we'll get up to around 75, right? And then we'll get up to around, let's say 85, and then 90, and 95, right? And you just keep halving the bad or doubling the good until you start to reach ideal state. Okay.
And any comment on stretch goals or stretch targets?
Yeah, so if you're feeling ambitious and if your team is aligned on your future state, so your specific number for what you want to get up to and the objectives or the actions, if we don't like that term, actions, the top 3 to 5 actions we're going to take to get to that goal. If you've done that for your next iteration, your next annual performance, then you can start talking about these. So, okay, well, this is what we're going to get by end of year 2020. Stretch goals, let's start to talk about those and put those over here in 2021. If the team is halfway through the year and they've already met their end of year objectives and targets for 2020, dude, start attacking 2021. Pull it over, right?
Sure.
Let's learn, let's adapt or adjust.
Right.
The counter argument to that is, okay, we met our objectives 6 months early for safety. Do we start going after our stretch objectives for safety for next year, or do we invest that people power and that money, that time and energy into the other objectives? So safety was easy, but wow, we're way behind on timeline. So let's focus on that instead. And then we start helping one another across the system. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And from a behavioral perspective, setting those targets and stretch goals, what does that do for someone that has this target, or they have, and if they see the alignment in their own objectives toward that target, what does that do for them personally?
Yeah, and so that's so there's a term that's sometimes used in healthcare and a few other companies called connecting the purpose. And this phrase just basically means are the actions that I'm taking, the behaviors that I'm taking on a daily basis, connecting to some higher purpose. And the easier it is for an individual to connect their daily behavior to an overall purpose, the more, if you will, motivated they are to work towards that. So they're not driven just by the audit police, and they're not driven just by financial incentives.
Right.
They actually truly care about this overall objective, and this is how they see their behaviors connecting directly to that. The classic example probably people might be familiar with is the custodian at NASA.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that one, Patrick?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Would you mind speaking to it?
Sure. So I'm trying to think about all the details, but I know that the custodian was asked by a president, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember which president it was?
I don't remember which one it was.
All right, President Kennedy had asked the janitor, what are you doing here? What do you? And the janitor answered that he was helping put a man on the moon, right? So the idea that his purpose wasn't, he understood his connection with purpose of what the overall mission was of NASA, not just to sweep the floors, but that he was just one piece of helping put a man on the moon. And so just a powerful analogy around that.
It is, and I love the motivation around that. He wasn't keeping the floors clean in order to meet a specific audit score. He wasn't doing that in order to meet his bonus for the year. Those helped influence his behavior, but the primary purpose that he saw, the connection that he saw, was helping the overall mission of NASA to put people on the moon. And it's amazing, right?
Yes.
I
Great
love
example.
So time check. Ooh, we're getting a little tight.
We are getting tight on time. We still got 15 minutes, so.
Okay. I'll leave time for more Q&A. So this is a lot to absorb, I get that, but here's an example of applying this at a program level. So Instead of the executive level or a project level, which you can apply it, this is a program, so something that's multi-year. In this case, we're looking at one of those years, one piece of the mountain map that they had. One of the things I want to talk about is in the previous slide, we're using the priority order as determined by Toyota. So they put safety first, then quality, then delivery, then cost, then people morale. In the program, series of projects, they were putting first people/customer. And this was a huge debate. So I came into this program after it was already started. It was floundering. They weren't hitting their goals. They were way behind schedule, things like that. And so I asked them, what is the purpose of this program, this agile transformation you're going under? And half the room said it's a cost reduction activity. We're trying to save hours, reduce headcount, things like that. Half the room said, no, our app ratings are horrible. They're at 1.6. They would be lower, but you literally can't give somebody a less than 1-star rating. So the reason we're trying to have this agile transformation is to improve our app score. And so one side of the room looked at the other side of the room and told each other they were wrong. Okay, well, enter behavioral science. Let's figure out why you have this different perspective. No, by the way, this difference of California versus Florida might be the reason we're floundering. We're headed in different directions, guys. We're prioritizing our work differently. Let's prioritize our work and get aligned at a leadership level. And then when a developer, somebody that's writing code, somebody that's a scrum master or a project manager is facing a decision, do I work on something that is going to or deliver a goal, a piece of our project that's going to help with the app rating score, or something that will help with costs? Which should I do? Should I deliver the code now, even though it's poor quality, right? But I'm meeting my timeline, my deadline, right? No, in this case, we're putting quality higher than delivery. So the frontline person would say, no, I intentionally delayed not shipping this because the quality wasn't good. And when that decision goes up to leadership and they figure out why they're behind, they accept that. And they say, oh, that's okay, because we put quality higher than we put timeline. So that's okay. Thank you for making that decision. It's a powerful technique for prioritizing the KPIs to allow others to make and prioritize work the same way. This one's all filled out. You can see iterations. So they, what we're talking about earlier, they wanted to go from 1.6 to 1.65. No, not a huge increase in about 3 months, 1 quarter, then 1.65 to 2.5, ultimately up to a perfect score of 5 stars. But as you start getting farther up the mountain on your journey, you start making more trade-off decisions. Is an investment in improving actions that would help with our overall star score more important than crashes? So they say, you know what, a 1-point improvement in app rating isn't as important as improving app crashes. Right? They might be related, but from an objectives or accomplishments perspective, let's switch our investment to another area instead, and you make that trade-off decision.
Okay.
So reflections. The whole point, here's another example from doing an entire division. The whole point on this one is red and greens. So let's say we've had a map, we've been doing it for a while, it's the end of the year, we've been looking at it every month and every quarter. Let's be honest with ourselves and say, hey, did we actually meet our goals, objectives, our scores, things like that? This is where you reflect and you do feedback and say, yep, we met or did not meet each of those. So if we look at future state 2, the overall safety goal was not met. They wanted to get to 80%, they actually got to 78. So we highlight it red. We show reality. One of the objectives that we thought would help with that, 50% reduction in variances, yes, we actually met that. We met this, we did not meet that, we highlight it red, so on. So whatever your company is doing, presenting reality on the visual helps with that conversation, the behaviors to get them lined up. Right. I'm going to point out something. You won't see yellow in here. So normally you see stoplight, red, yellow, green.
Right.
The behaviors in this particular organization, there was low trust. So people did not feel safe to show red. They thought it would be associated with themselves. They would be punished, things like that. So we took a lesson from Nationwide Insurance, who they've done fabulous work, did lots of presentations, and there's a book out there by Tom Payer and some others. But they talk about earning the right to use yellow. And what they mean by that is when they started some of their transformations, they only used red or green. Mm-hmm. And the reason was if they allowed people to use yellow, then everything on their version would be either green or yellow and nothing would be red because it wasn't safe to show red. And so in this organization, by the end of the second year, we still were not safe to show yellow. So we made the determination to stick to just, it was red or it was green.
That's an interesting point. I like it.
Safety, trust, these are big components with your visual, and being honest about your current state of the safety and the trust.
Yeah. We have 2 quick questions, but I know we're running tight on time. Okay. Do you want me to throw these out here real quick?
Yep.
One of them is, what struggles do you have getting the executive leadership team to buy into this? That'd be the first one.
Okay. So if they're brand new to their continuous improvement journey, they've not worked on iterating and improving for a period of time, it's hard. It's really hard to get alignment between them. But that said, I'm going to talk about ideal state for this for a second. Imagine the beauty of you have the HR journey map, their mountain map, and you compare that to the IT mountain map. You compare that to the finance mountain map, and you see where they line up and they don't line up. And then the executives are allowed to have this conversation where they attack one another's journey maps, mountain maps, to see whether or not they line up, and they work on improving those so that they do, right? Shouldn't the mountain map for finance line up with the mountain map for manufacturing? You know, shouldn't it line up with the one for HR for finance? So the best way to get there is probably what part of the question was, is to find one executive that's willing to give it a try and just work with that one executive and show success with that one executive, and that'll spread.
Right. There was great answer. The other question was, how long does this workshop take? If you were to walk someone through this workshop, what would the time frame be?
Yep. So I've done this in 2 hours up to 8 hours. Mm-hmm. And so
probably depends, I'm sure.
It depends a lot on the level of debate that happens with the team, how much of the KPI conversation they've had before, how much safety and trust there is with the team. I'll say that no matter what, there's always work to be done after the workshop. Right. So you can, if you do a 2 hour workshop, I would just book a 2 hour workshop almost every week so that you work through it. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So real quick, you can do this whiteboard style as well. So not just with different digital tools. Whiteboard, I'll say most recently, is a lot less popular. But here are some of the steps that you can see below on how to go through it. We tend to use non-relevant examples first. So if you're in manufacturing, I like to use a patient experience example. We use non-relevant examples so people don't get stuck in the content. The first time people are talking about what is perfect for our space, if you're in IT, you don't use an IT example because they'll get stuck in the content and they'll debate the content instead of learning the structure of the tool and the behaviors associated with it. So use a non-relevant example, in this case, patient experience, get them aligned on what perfect patient experience is like, and then you switch over to, okay, now that we've learned the structure and the tool and the behaviors and how it works, let's apply it to us. So patient experience works well for that if you are not in healthcare. Again, these are examples just like I talked about in the beginning with Herman Miller and some of the terms that they used, and then translating that over into specific numeric KPIs.
Yeah, and this is an example that everyone can understand because everyone has been to a doctor's office. So, you know, everyone can kind of play the position of the patient and understand how this would make sense. And then obviously, like you said, then bring it back to, whatever they're doing within their industry.
Yeah, exactly. Another one we use often is a coffee shop example. So a lot of people have experienced that.
Okay.
And then, take it home. So, Acme is just a generic terminology, but you have them discuss what perfection looks like. You have them identify what type of metric category, KPI category it is, quality, delivery, morale, cost. Then you get into what the specific numerics are associated with that. By going through the workshop, you're teaching people to be able to translate specific observations, behaviors, actions into measurable items. And that's part of the value of the workshop as well, is they learn how to teach this to others. It's a really simple approach. So that makes it a lot more repeatable. Time check, getting short here. Some websites, additional materials you can go to. I want to give a shout out not only to PA Consulting's website and all the beautiful materials they have out there. Obviously, I'm going to give a plug for my own website. By the way, if you're not familiar with Sir Terry Pratchett, he's a prolific author. In his books, the term Kelda just means leader. Here's the Lean IT guide. This is Nationwide's one of their books by Tom Pater and another individual. I want to talk about this since we talk about strategy so much.
Yeah.
Getting the Right Things Done by Pascal Dennis. So here's my severely marked up copy. It is the best book on strategy I've ever read. And it just so happens to be a lean CI book. I'm going to say that Pascal Dennis, the author of the book, he deserves an honorary doctorate in behavioral science. He did an excellent job of paying attention to all the behaviors that are necessary in proper strategy development, deployment, as well as the tools. So
nice. And that was Getting the Right Things Done. Good.
Yep. Letter N by Pascal Dennis. He has a lot of great articles out as well.
Perfect.
And then closer.
All right.
So
well, thank you.
Shut up there, my screen here.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Edward. Appreciate everything. Appreciate your time. Appreciate all of the amazing information. We have a few more questions that came into the chat box. We'll try to get those answered maybe over the next week. So I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of the questions. But for those of you that are attending the webinar today, thank you very much. Thank you, Edward. Next week, we're going to have Katie Anderson on, and she's a dear friend of mine as well, and actually was planning to head out to Japan with her next month. However, that's been canceled, unfortunately. But Katie Anderson is going to be on next Friday at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and she's going to be speaking on learning to lead, leading to learn, skills to become a more intentional, people-centered leader. So a very, very great discussion. She's been writing a book, and I believe she might have maybe some ideas, or might be sharing with us a little bit of insight around her book. So I'm excited about that. But you will all receive an email with a registration for next week's webinar. And then also we're going to share in that email 2 articles from Behavioral Science Magazine that Edward has written. So please check those out as well. So with that said, thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. Thank you again, Edward. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a blast.
All right. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.